Next, a hearing on the incident between U.S. Park Police and protesters near the White House at Lafayette Square on June 1st. Law enforcement officers advanced on protesters gathered in the park to protest the death of George Floyd to clear the way for President Trump to walk from the White House to St. John's Episcopal Church, where President Trump took pictures holding a Bible. This House Natural Resources Committee hearing is 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Thank you very much. The Committee on Natural Resources will come to order. The committee is meeting today to hear testimony on the U.S. Park Police attack on peaceful protesters at Lafayette Square. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from the witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I'm asking unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements and documents or motions, as described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with our fully in-person meeting, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our fully in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Anyone present at the hearing today must wear a mask covering their mouth and nose. The Speaker of the House and the Sergeant of Arms, acting upon the recommendations of the attending physician, require face coverings for all indoor gatherings over 15 minutes in length, such as committee meetings. Accordingly, to maintain decorum and protect the safety of members and staff, the chair will not recognize any member in this hearing room to speak who is not wearing a mask. According to House Rule 17 and Committee Rule 3D, the chair retains the right of recognition of any member who wishes to speak or offer a motion. The right includes the responsibility to maintain decorum. As permitted by the Sergeant of Arms guidance, the chair will make exceptions for members briefly removing their masks to facilitate lip reading by viewers who are deaf or hard of hearing, as I'm doing presently. Finally, members or witnesses experience technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. With that, I will recognize myself for the opening statement. A Minneapolis police officer pressed his knee on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we all have witnessed the slow and painful death of Mr. Floyd. And it has created a demanding anguish cry for action to deal with the legacy of racism in this country, that anguish cry has risen all across the nation. Thousands of Americans have taken to the street to offer a strong declaration that is really a plea for basic humanity, that Black Lives Matter. They protest to honor the all too many Black men, women, and children whose lives have been affected, cut short at the hands of racism and brutality. They protest to demand change and to demand that their constitutional rights be upheld, and call upon government for systemic response to the systemic racism that afflicts us as a legacy. Astonishingly, instead of honoring this collective outcry for justice, this administration answered demands to end police brutality with more police brutality. On the afternoon of June 1st, President Trump called state governors and berated them for not being aggressive enough, saying, and I quote, "You have to dominate. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time." He made clear this is a war, us against the protesters. Of course, he was probably especially angry after we all found out that he had retreated to the White House bunker the night before. That same afternoon, overwhelmingly peaceful protesters gathered at Lafayette Square Park. At Lafayette Square, Park Police, National Guard, and other law enforcement lined the perimeter of the park. Then, around 6:30, nearly a half hour before DC curfew would take into effect, the park police and their law enforcement partner suddenly moved in on the protesters. Peaceful protesters, innocent bystanders, and members of the press were all caught up in a chaotic barrage of shields, batons, horses, projectiles, and tear gas. The militarized assault even hit people from the historic St. John's Church, neighbor to the White House and a friend of presidents for many years. Clergy and church staff who were handing out water were reportedly pushed off their own patio by officers. Once everybody had been forcibly expelled from the so-called battle space, the world witnessed something even more incredible. President Trump, accompanied by the Attorney General and other White House advisors, and, should be added, top military brass, strolled through the park to St. John's Church, where he posed with the Bible for a brief photo op, and St. John's had no idea the president was going to do this. Peaceful protesters, church, and press all fell victim to this administration's violent and senseless operation. Remarkably, these victims also embody our three main freedoms protected by the First Amendment: freedom of speech, and assembly, freedom of religion, and freedom of the press. The Trump administration is still scrambling to explain how this happened, often contradicting itself. Ample video evidence and the accounts of people at the scene, people who felt the batons hit their bodies and the chemical munitions burned their eyes. We are fortunate to have some of those people here as witnesses today, as well as the bishop who presides over St. John's Church itself. I want to thank all of you for giving of your time to help us answer the many questions still surrounding this indefensible attack on our own people and our basic freedoms. I now would like to turn to the ranking member, Mr. Bishop, for his opening statements. Mr. Bishop, you're recognized.
Thank you for wherever you are. I know that when Democrats were in the minority, they used to object to some of the titles on which we gave our hearings. You guys have learned very well from that. I appreciate that. Not only, is that better? Not only have you come up with new titles that are unique for yourselves, but this one is especially inflammatory and pejorative. So congratulations on it. There are issues that need to be discussed. That said, we have serious issues to address in the present, and we'd be selling our society very short were we to ensure, without ensuring that there is full truth as to what is going on that is recorded in our history, not just a myopic and biased view. And unfortunately, that means that this hearing, as far as understanding the truth of what went on and coming up with a good history, is going to be invalid. Two of the witnesses that we'll be hearing today are involved in litigation or investigations and are here even before any of that stuff started, which may be legal, but it's quite highly questionable. An invitation was given to some in the Park Service who all volunteered to come in later after the litigation period had at least begun, but that was rejected. And instead, we decided to move ahead with what can only be described as really good political theater. I mean, there are questions that need to be answered. There is a question of why the police moved prior to the curfew actually existing. There are questions of why the DC mayor decided to put a curfew on in the first place. There are questions of, was this part of a plan that was established 48 hours prior to the event or not? There are questions of why 3 warnings with a decibel level that is equivalent to a jet aircraft taking off were not heard by people, or were they actually there, and when were they done? There is a question about the amount of violence that took place. Protests, as we all know, are legal, but arson is not. Destruction of property is not. Attacking police is not. We do know that in the Park Service police, within a period of 2 weeks, within this, there are 50 policemen that were attacked, that were harmed, that were injured. At least one went to the hospital, presumably to conduct surgery at the time. All of those are legitimate questions, and all of those legitimate questions are not going to be addressed in this committee hearing today. It's simply the structure is not designed to do that. The structure is not designed to come up with a historical statement. The structure is designed to come up with good drama. Like, on the flight back here, I was able to watch 3 movies. 2 of them were historical dramas, historical fiction. They were well done. And what we are attempting to do today would fit nice into that genre of activities. The other was a musical. I wish you could do that one. That was more enjoyable. But the Democrats here have now produced something that is not going to be substantive, that is not going to be historical, that is really a distraction. It is political theater as an attempt to do it. So, Mr. Grijalva, for you and Watkins, you have learned this job very well. I would urge you to become producers of movies. You can do extremely well in that area. But please don't try and write a textbook, because you are leaving too many questions out that need to be part of the narrative and need to be part of the answers. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and now I'll introduce the witnesses. Let me begin with Keyshawn McDonald, DC resident, and was a peaceful protester on the day of the event. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin, and I will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend the members and witnesses joining remotely use active speaker thumbnail view, so they may pin the timer on their screen and see members in the room. With that, Mr. McDonald, welcome. Time is yours, sir.
Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Member Bishop and members of this Committee on National Resources. My name is Keyshawn McDonald. I'm a 39-year-old resident of Northeastern Washington, D.C. I have been a resident here for the past 5 years, but was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. I honorably served my country in the U.S. Navy on the USS Leyte Gulf as a yeoman 3rd class. I'm employed with the United Airlines as a mechanic at the Dallas Airport. I appreciate this invitation to share my experience with you today. On June 1st, I decided to join in a peaceful protest against racial injustice. Now, I know that there was a curfew imposed for that evening, so I went down as part of my usual run and planned to run back home by the curfew time of 7 p.m. I arrived on 16th and I Street around 6 o'clock p.m. I observed military vehicles, uniformed soldiers, blocked off streets, and a huge police presence. I began recording the scene on my phone.
Mr. McDonald, we can try to continue again, if you don't mind.
Say that again. Okay. I around 16 I observed military vehicles, uniformed soldiers, and blocked off streets and a huge police presence. I began recording the scene from my phone, primarily because I wanted to record this moment in history. Secondly, for my safety, because Trump had made threats of ominous weapons and vicious dogs to be used on protesters. I walked from 16th and I directly towards Lafayette Park and observed a huge group of diverse, peaceful protesters chanting for George Floyd and for change. It was an overwhelming experience, and it was powerful to be a part of it. The chanting continued around 6:25 p.m. when officers started approaching us as we stood on the north side of Lafayette Park along the fencing. The officers stopped for a few minutes, about 10 to 15 yards away, then they moved closer as if we were posing a threat, which we were not. They got directly in front of us to the point we could have conversation with them. They got very close to us in a threatening kind of way. They gave no instructions, and it just showed a show of force. We stood our ground. We told them we were peaceful and we wanted no trouble. We were met with silence. At no time did I hear any instructions to move, and if we did hear instructions, I would have moved. I'm sure the crowd would have moved because we were very peaceful during the entire time before we were attacked. Right before 6:30 p.m., I observed a line of police in riot RoboCop gear coming in from my left. Now, at this point, the soldiers were communicating, but it was yelling, "Move, move." They were not walking. They were pushing and running towards us with their shields, and people started to panic. A world of confusion ensued. I could not really understand what was going on, why they were responding in that manner, seeing it was way before curfew, 30 minutes before curfew. I observed a black male fall to the ground, and protesters circled around him and demanded police stop so a medic could assist him. The officer stopped briefly on the south side of St. John's Church. We grabbed the male and started to retreat. The Police started throwing tear gas and flashbangs, fast grenades at us for no reason. We were retreating. We didn't need any help retreating. Using weapons on us was ridiculous. It just made the situation dangerous. Even before the officers charged us or fired their weapons, it had been peaceful. This is the most important block in the world. We are in front of the most powerful and governing house in the world. It's citizens who are being attacked by their own government just for asking and protesting for change. I was scared, confused, and angry. I did CS gas training in boot camp. This group of demonstrators were not soldiers. This wasn't a battle station test, but it was similar to a boot camp drill. It is unacceptable to treat protesters that way in our own city and nation. Once I got home, I reviewed my footage and pictures. It was then I noticed U.S. Park Police among the officers who forced us up from the left as we stood along the fence in Lafayette Park. I joined a lawsuit challenging the attack on me and other demonstrators so someone will be held accountable, and this moment isn't forgotten in history. I've seen this footage of this kind of attack on African-American protesters in the 1960s when we wanted change. The dogs and water cannons from the 60s have turned into tear gas and flashbangs today. It hurts as a black man to see it's 2020 and we still have a government that will do this over again over something that seems so right to protest about. The damage was done the minute the president decided to violate our First Amendment rights. How is it the KKK can hold a rally in D.C. and be protected, but when a black man is killed, we protest in honor of him and we are attacked? How can you not perceive this attack on the Black Lives Matter movement? I served this country so everyone could enjoy the freedoms granted to us under this Constitution. If anyone had the right to be there, it was me. I should not have been forced to move and attack with tear gas and flashbangs as I was peacefully protesting for change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me ask Amelia Brace, correspondent, 7 News Australia. Time is yours, please.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Bishop, and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak today. For more than 3 years, I've been the US correspondent for 7 News, one of Australia's largest commercial broadcasters. I've been called to testify about my experience covering protests near Lafayette Square Park, particularly the incident in which my cameraman Tim Myers and I were physically assaulted by Park Police on June the 1st while we were broadcasting live to Australia with hundreds of thousands of people watching, including our families. This video, which formed part of the coverage in Australia, shows the incident from multiple angles. Police begin their attack.
We've just had to run about a block as police moved in. We've been fired at with rubber bullets. My cameraman has been hit. We've also seen tear gas being used. Here we go, they're moving through again. This is exactly what it looks like. Exactly what it looks like. We're staying safely.
That's a photographer. What's going on now?
Hit with a shield in the stomach, a punch to the lens. Another officer lashes out with a baton as we run, trying to get out of an early surge.
You heard us yelling there that we were media, but they don't care. They are being indiscriminate at the moment. They chased us down that street, and as you see, they were firing these rubber bullets at everyone. There is tear gas, and now we are really surrounded by the police, and you really saw the way that they dealt with my cameraman Tim. They're quite violent, and they do not care who they're targeting at the moment.
We began our coverage at Lafayette Square around 5:45 p.m. The atmosphere was passionate but peaceful. In fact, it was far less tense than it had been the night before. As we prepared for our 6:30 p.m. live broadcast, we noticed riot police lines begin to form. We were not alarmed by this sight, as it initially resembled the enforcement of curfew the night before, and we still had more than half an hour before this curfew was due to take effect. Regardless, members of the media were exempt from curfew restrictions. We did not hear any warning from law enforcement that the area was to be cleared or that the curfew would be enforced early. Suddenly, the police line surged forward. We moved back along with many protesters. Police lining the park used automatic weapons to fire non-lethal rounds. Tim was hit with a projectile in the back of the neck and our equipment was damaged. After this first surge, we took cover behind a tree as Tim tried to get the now damaged live transmitter working. We saw the line of police start to walk towards us at a walking pace. To ensure we were completely out of the way of both police and protesters, we moved to the fence line where we were sheltered by a concrete wall and off the sidewalk. We were clearly a news crew. Most notably, Tim was holding a large television camera. We were also surrounded by other members of the media and given no directive by police to move on. As I began reporting live, the line of police suddenly and without warning began charging forward at a sprinting pace, knocking protesters to the ground. A park police officer who was passing us stopped, turned towards Tim and rammed him in the chest and stomach with the edge of his riot shield, causing Tim to keel over and drop down. The officer then took a step back, paused, then punched his hand directly into the front of Tim's camera, grabbing the lens. As this happened, Tim and I were both repeatedly shouting the word media. A second officer appeared to intervene, giving us the opportunity to move. As I was running away, a third officer pushed through the group, going out of his way to strike me with a truncheon. As we tried once again to clear the advancing lines of police, loud flashbangs boomed around us and some sort of chemical irritant and plumes of smoke filled the air. I can be heard screaming as I was struck by non-lethal projectiles directly to my legs and backside. The incident prompted Australia's Prime Minister to direct our ambassador to the United States to seek a full investigation. As a reporter, I have no interest in becoming the story, but over recent weeks, many of us have been left with no choice. I've been shocked to see how many journalists have been attacked, beaten and detained just for doing their jobs. Covering protests does carry unavoidable risks, but the media's role is essential. We don't just have a right to be there, we have an obligation. As Australian journalists, we are the eyes and the ears of our people, in this case, witnessing civil unrest in the capital of our most powerful and closest ally. It is crucial to democracy that journalists be allowed to do their job freely and safely, and that is certainly something we should expect in the world's greatest democracy.
The Public Interest Law at George Washington University. Professor, time is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, for the honor of appearing before you today to talk about the controversy of the clearing of Lafayette Park. For roughly 14 years, I was one of the lead counsels in the World Bank protest litigation that produced the guidelines and case law currently applied in mass demonstration events like the one in Lafayette Park. Much of that litigation centered on the mass arrest of hundreds of individuals in Pershing Park, which is not far from Lafayette Park, in 2002. I appear today in the hopes of offering some legal perspective on the governing standards that apply in these cases and also the facts that a court would likely look at in reviewing these allegations, which are quite serious. In appearing, I should disclose that I have previously discussed this matter. I criticized the level of force used to remove the protesters from the area and called for a congressional investigation into the operation. I also stated that night that I thought the attack on the Australian journalists appeared entirely unjustified and unlawful. I continue to hold those opinions, as I discuss in my written testimony. My written testimony looks at the motivation, the authority, and the means used in the operation. 2 points on nomenclature. I refer to the operation as the clearing operation to establish the perimeter to create the fence line. This process appeared to take about 22 to 26 minutes from the timelines that I've reviewed. But as this committee has in the title of the hearing, as the chairman did in his opening statement, we're all referring to Lafayette Park or Lafayette Square Park. Obviously, we're not talking about just the park itself. The protesters had been removed from the park. There was a temporary fence line. Most of the activity occurred on 8th Street, and some of the protesters were pushed back to, I believe, I Street. The park police has argued they were creating this perimeter so they could establish the fence line. But obviously, when we talk about Lafayette Park, as with the title of this hearing, we're talking about a larger area. And by the way, that is an area of what I think would warrant congressional review of how far those protesters were pushed back and why. As to the photo op allegation, that goes to the motivation behind this operation. I won't dwell on that much. As my testimony indicates, this may be a case where correlation does not mean causation. There has been a number of statements and timelines presented that indicate that the plan to clear the park, create the fence line, was in fact proposed 2 days earlier. It was submitted on Sunday night, I believe. It was approved in some form on Monday morning. An order went out around 2. The National Guard apparently was delayed in arriving that pushed that operation past 5, and there was a delay in the fencing material. So whether all of that is true or not is exactly why we need a congressional inquiry, and that is an area that I would encourage the committee to look at. In terms of the order itself, just because there was damage and there was violence the day before does not mean that an order is per se lawful or that it was done in a lawful way. In the World Bank protest litigation and other cases, we've established guidelines that you must have 3 audible warnings that are spaced apart. You must also give ample opportunity for dispersal. In the World Bank case, we had the encirclement of everyone in Pershing Park Freedom Plaza. So even if they had been given those warnings, which they weren't, they wouldn't have been able to remove themselves. In this case, it does appear the 3 warnings were given, but that is based on the government's account. And once again, that is an issue for you to look at. It also does appear that protesters could remove themselves because they weren't encircled. However, if you look at these films, there was a very rapid approach of the line to the perimeter line, which is beyond the fence line. That line was brought back to the fence line later. That rapid pushing forward is something that is a legitimate question for this committee to ask. That is, was there enough time? Was it necessary to use the level of force that it did? On the level of force, as my testimony goes through in detail, courts have largely deferred to an objective, reasonable officer in determining what force should be used. This comes out of the Graham case. It's called the Graham analysis. I point out that a number of district courts have ruled recently against the use of tear gas and pepper spray. And as I say in my testimony, that distinction between tear gas and pepper spray is really not that essential because courts tend to group them together. The important question is, was there a reasonable use of those devices? My summary ultimately concludes that the order to clear the park is probably going to be held as lawful. That the government does have the right to clear the park. Whether the means used to clear the park were lawful is something that this committee and other committees may be able to shed some light on. Many courts would express concern over the rapid escalation of force, particularly in a protest involving police abuse allegations. And for that reason, I compliment Congress in looking into this. I'd be happy to answer any questions on the legal aspects should members have those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me now ask our last witness, the Right Reverend MARIANN BUDDE, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. Bishop, the time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Bishop, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. As you said, my name is MARIANN BUDDE. I serve as Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, which counts among its parishes St. John's Lafayette Square. I appear today to express my deep concern about the events of June 1, when our government resorted to acts of violence against peaceful protesters and prevented clergy and lay members of the church from exercising their ministry on the grounds of St. John's. We in the Episcopal Church believe that the issues of racial and social justice are core tenets of the Christian faith. The Bible teaches that all human beings are created in the likeness and image of God. As children of God, all are to be treated with equal dignity and respect. Embedded in our nation's history and institutions is the shameful abuse of Black Americans and other persons of color, justified by the sinful notion of white supremacy, that whiteness is the human standard from which all other human beings deviate and are somehow less human, less worthy of equal treatment. And as Christians, we are called by God to rectify that injustice. Our faith compels us to join those around the country and the globe who have engaged in nonviolent protest, to call for an end to racist policies and practices, and to say clearly with one voice that Black lives matter. Now, for Episcopalians, the issue of racial justice is a shameful part of our history, for we were once the church of slave holders. And like the White House, St. John's Lafayette Square was built with enslaved labor. Yet throughout our history, our noblest members have fought for the liberation of the enslaved, full human and civil rights for all people, and to be a church that welcomes all. We have and continue to struggle to come to terms with our racist past and legacy, and that of American society as a whole. We strive to be a voice for peace and the fundamental dignity of all human beings, knowing that at our most faithful, we stand on the side of justice. And so we stand today at this critical moment. When nonviolent protesters began to gather at Lafayette Square, as a church, we decided to be present, to add our voice to the call for justice, to stand with and minister to all other peaceful protesters gathered there. This was and is for us an act of faith. Our ministry was suddenly and forcefully interrupted by government officials. First on June 1st, when the government violently cleared protesters and clergy alike from the area surrounding St. John's, and then in coming days, when the government denied us access to the church to conduct a vigil. These actions, and in particular the use of violence against peaceful protesters, were antithetical to the teachings of the Bible and what we stand for as a church. When our government announced its intention to use military force against American citizens in the Rose Garden that day, it struck me as an escalation of violence that could cause unnecessary suffering. Then, to see the government carry out that threat moments later, I was horrified. It was dehumanizing and in violation of the protesters' right to be in that space. Then, when the president held up a Bible outside our church as if to claim the mantle of spiritual authority over what had just transpired, I knew that I had to speak. Nowhere does the Bible condone the use of violence against the innocent, especially those who are standing up for justice. It was a misappropriation of Scripture and a usurpation of our sacred space. I raised these issues to call attention to an abuse of power on the part of our government, which is also at the heart of the larger struggle for racial justice. While it's true, there have been instances of vandalism at St. John's in recent weeks, we cannot let those events and others overshadow the fundamental cause of justice. People across our nation are united as never before in recognizing that the way we police our communities needs to change. The way we treat people of color in this country needs to change. Yes, we care deeply about our churches as buildings, but in the end, buildings can be rebuilt, windows can be replaced, pillars can be repainted. We can never bring back the lives that have been lost due to horrific police violence. These deaths are the true outrage. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and so many more. I don't want anything that has happened at St. John's, either before the protests or in the weeks since, to distract us from that fact. Black lives matter, and our faith compels us to seek equal justice for all people. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
The testimony. Let me now turn to the questions and recognize Mr. Huffman. for any questions he might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks so much to the witnesses for great testimony. I want to begin by taking issue respectfully with the ranking member's mocking of the title of this hearing. The hearing is titled, "The U.S. Park Police Attack on Peaceful Protesters at Lafayette Square." That is not dramatization, that is fact. That is exactly what happened. And if there was a shred of evidence to support the gaslighting counter-narrative that we've heard from this administration, I would think that the gentleman across the aisle would have called a fact witness to offer that narrative. We got a very thoughtful explanation of the legal framework from Professor Turley. Thank you, Professor, for that. But we didn't get any fact witnesses to support this gaslighting, and I think that speaks volumes. Before we get into further questions, I want to express my disappointment that at least so far, our friends across the aisle apparently no longer have the same concerns about heavy-handed police tactics, militarization, and other police abuse by Department of Interior agencies, concerns they used to speak passionately about when Barack Obama was president. Apparently those concerns disappeared when Donald Trump became president, but some of us are old enough to remember the hearings that the Republican majority held in 2013 and 14, entitled, and now we are talking about those incendiary titles we used to see, entitled "Threats, Intimidation, and Bullying by Federal Land Managing Agencies." And at the time, one of our Republican colleagues described, I quote, "These type of very heavy-handed SWAT-like teams with non-DOJ agencies being used as the tip of the spear for federal law enforcement." He called it heavy-handed, intimidating to the American people, and said it threatened the trust that's so important between American citizens and their government. That was 2014, after an all-white armed militia gathered to stop federal land agency law enforcement from confiscating Cliven Bundy's cattle, which he had been illegally grazing for 20 years. Law enforcement backed down because of that heavily armed militia protesting. But at the time, and then again in 2016, during the armed occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon by a similar group, an angry, white, heavily armed group of protesters, we heard a very different tune about federal policing tactics from congressional Republicans. Some of them introduced legislation to eliminate law enforcement authorities from the BLM and the Forest Service on the grounds that these agencies were, quote, armed to the teeth. They described armed police at Department of Interior agencies as, quote, dangerous, unnecessary, and sending the wrong message. Some of our Republican colleagues on this committee were co-sponsors of that bill. Talk about defund the police. Republicans in Congress were eager to do exactly that to make sure that folks like Cliven Bundy could continue breaking the law with impunity. Fast forward to the peaceful protests for racial justice at Lafayette Square. Peaceful, unarmed protesters were met with a DOI police response far more aggressive, far more militarized, and far less necessary than anything used against those white militias in 2014 and 2016. As our witnesses confirm, as any objective person viewing the video knows, heavily armed U.S. Park Police carried out orders to use chemical agents and other forceful means to clear protesters so that Donald Trump could have a weird photo op with someone's Bible. Most people would consider this heavy-handed, intimidating, dangerous, unnecessary, sending the wrong message, all those exact terms that our Republican colleagues used to describe police tactics against white militias when they were defending law-breaking ranchers in 2014 and 2016. I'm disappointed that we don't have the same level of concern from our colleagues across the aisle, but we haven't heard from many of them, so maybe we will hear it. It's important that they not be silent or openly supportive of this heavy-handed, militarized police abuse directed at black people and those supporting them who were peacefully protesting for racial justice. What's so different about the situation today? The president, the people protesting, and their cause. To our witnesses today, please know there are many members of Congress and people across this country who stand with you and support your rights to protest injustice. This should not have happened to you. And we are committed to exercising our oversight authority, even if some of our colleagues are now sanguine content with their double standard, standing with President Trump to the bitter end. I yield back.
And yields. Chair recognizes Mr. McClintock. Sir, time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we need to make a distinction between the right to peaceable assembly, which is sacred and protected under our First Amendment, and violence, arson, and vandalism, which is not so protected. I think we've got a video of damage done in Washington, D.C. in the days leading up to this. I wonder if we could play that.
Yards away from the front of the White House. Protesters have lit a fire that's about to go up. There's no telling if it's going to hit the tree above.
As soon as those cops then step over that man and start shooting at us, then we want to be upset. If we're sitting here antagonizing, that's not a protest. That's a crime. That's a crime.
Looting has begun. In Washington, D.C., just a couple of blocks from the White House.
Looting is not a problem. It's a part of rioting, but like, it's coffee shops. They didn't hurt nobody. It's not a big business.
These were the events leading up to the incident on June the 1st. The Secretary of Interior describes the situation they were facing thusly. Beginning on Saturday, May 30th, 2020, the U.S. Park Police were under a state of siege and routinely subject to attack by violent crowds. The incidents are numerous and include U.S. Park Police officers having their police cars vandalized, being subject to bombardment by lighted flares, Molotov cocktails, rocks, bricks, bottles, and other projectiles, and physical assault so violent that to date over 50 area law enforcement officers have been injured, to include one U.S. Park Police officer so violently attacked that he required emergency surgery. To describe what happened in Washington, D.C. as mostly peaceful protests, I think is a lot like describing Scott Peterson as a mostly faithful husband or Al Capone as a mostly law-abiding businessman. Professor Turley, what are the responsibilities of peaceful protesters when a protest turns violent?
Thank you, Congressman. The way that the courts have addressed this is that they recognize that these protests are, in fact, the display of a First Amendment right of free speech. However, the courts have said that areas can be cleared for unpermitted demonstrations if warnings are given and they are not heeded, as long as the demonstrators have an avenue by which to exit, which didn't occur.
Let me ask you this. What are the responsibilities of truly peaceful protesters when an assembly's been declared unlawful?
At that point, when they're asked to leave an area, they are required by law to leave. That doesn't go to the means by which you can move them, but it certainly means that the order itself to disperse is likely to be held as lawful. And courts also do allow for that perimeter to be pushed back if you're assembling something like a fence How far that perimeter should be established, the courts look at. They often look at, for example, the Park Police often establishes a perimeter.
And that would be a legal question to be examined by the courts. What course of action would you recommend to Congress?
I'm sorry, sir?
What recommendation would you make to Congress?
I think that Congress needs to ask a number of questions. I've listed 10 that are standard questions that are used in protest cases, including the essential evidence that we often look to, things like running resumes to determine what orders were given and when. I encourage Congress to do that. They also should take a look, as a court will, at the level of damage and violence on the other side. The government has argued that 100 officers in the area had been injured, and the Park Police say that 50 of their own officers had been injured. That's a very high level of injury rate for law enforcement.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask Mr. Chairman of the Subcommittee, Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all the witnesses for attending, taking their time to share their experiences while they were there. You know, I worked before I came to Congress and was an elected official as a community organizer and also as an activist in my community. And I know that there's a certain amount of risk that's always involved when you stand up for what you believe is right, for protesting, for speaking out. So my question is to each of the panelists, first to Mr. McDonald, why did you feel that it was worth that risk to be at Lafayette Square that day, and why was it important for you to be there?
Well, George Floyd was just 46, 47 years old, and I'm 39. I'll be 40 this year, so I believe him dying it affected my life, so I just wanted to make sure I was down there and being a part of a peaceful protest to voice inequity and justice in the Department against Black people. So I felt it was my duty to be down there, and I had a chance to be down there. I never had a chance to be at another protest ever, so I took it upon my duty to go down there and make sure I was protesting for George Floyd.
Thank you. Ms. Brace, as a reporter, why did you feel that it was important for you to be there that day?
As I mentioned in my opening statement, it's imperative to democracy that journalists be on the ground. Journalists can't work remotely. We can't see what's happening on the front line of an incident if we're standing a block away. So in order to fulfill our role in democracy, we have to be standing right in the middle. So I think where we were was incredibly important in terms of telling the story of what happened that day.
Thank you. And Bishop Budd, while you were not physically present, you were supportive of people in your diocese who were there, and you've spoken out here and today and publicly about it. Why was it important for them to be there, and why was it so important for you to speak out?
The issues of racial equity and justice are fundamental to the Christian faith, and they are of primary importance now in our country when the inequities, particularly in policing, have become so blatant. To be honest, I couldn't have stopped my members from coming because they were so determined to add their voice and their presence to the gathering of nonviolent protest. What we wanted to do as well was to acknowledge our presence, to stand with people, and also to offer whatever we could to ensure greater safety, providing hand sanitizers and water and masks even to make sure that whatever we did contributed to the public good while we were making our statement in support of a change in racist practices and policies.
Well, I want to thank all of you for sharing your stories and why you were there and your motivations for being there, all of this, which is protected under the Constitution. I have also very important questions about the events for the administration. I'm very concerned that no one in the administration has shown up today to answer the questions. But Mr. McDonald, Ms. Brace, Bishop Budd, I want to thank you for standing up for what is your constitutional right to stand up for. and for standing up for just what is right and just today. And I'm glad that you spoke out on June 1st and that you're speaking out today. I really appreciate your testimony. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and let me turn to the ranking member, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, and I was grateful to see Mr. Lowenthal by video there, and in comments that I was doing, unless you're trying out for the role of Grizzly Adams, I expect you to be without a beard when you come back here. Deal?
Maybe. Almost a deal.
Whatever,
I'll
whatever.
Take
all
that
right. So,
and ask you to grow a beard.
You would be enthralled with it. So, look, in light of the statements that were made by Mr. Lowenthal, Mr. Huffman as well, even though the administration was willing to come and testify but was not necessarily allowed in the timeline that the Democrats decided to do, let me ask at least to put into the record to give some element of balance to this. First, a statement by the Park Police. This is by Chief Moynihan, detailing what he was doing into, which includes the fact that 50 police were injured, and it verifies that there were 3 warnings that were issued at that time. Also, a statement by the National Park Service that goes into the memorials and statues that have been vandalized in recent weeks, as of last week anyway, for the MPS, especially here in the District of Columbia. And if I could ask unanimous consent to have those placed in the record?
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And I also I would have appreciated the questions of Mr. Huffman, but there weren't actually questions. The 2 issues that he mentioned that took place back in the West were dismissed legally because of excesses by the prosecution of the Park Service at that time. I admit that, which is the question that we have at hand here, which unfortunately this hearing will not go to because we do not have any of the administration witnesses allowed to be here which could answer those. But we do have you, Mr. Turley, and I appreciate your willingness at short notice to come in here and try and be an impartial voice, or at least a voice that is set aside from personal involvement within this particular situation. Actually, you're the only one that's doing that. So let me just go about the concepts of protest. We know that the First Amendment guarantees every citizen the right to peaceful assembly. Can you define what that peaceful assembly would look like, very briefly?
Well, peaceful assembly means that you cannot be stopped from appearing in a demonstration, a protest, a gathering, and particularly in speaking against the government, as long as you comply with the federal and state laws. It does not give you a license to violate laws. It obviously doesn't give you a license to commit arson or any other crime. It also does not give you a license to be in an unpermitted space if you're given warnings and opportunity to leave. That's the position of cases like Barnum and Chang that I go through in my testimony.
So, and what you did is you simply elaborated where there is a constitutional limit that can be placed on those particular rights.
There are limits on, there are no absolute rights in the Constitution, and the courts actually have handed down some really, I think, quite profound opinions on this. The Supreme Court has talked about how important it is to give a breathing room to free speech and protests, but has also said that this is not an absolute right. This is a right that is enjoyed within the confines of federal and state law.
So I think you did this in your opening statement and also in your written testimony, but in like 15 seconds or so. Can you just re-identify the facts, the conditions that would legally permit law enforcement to disperse an assembly, like happened on 8th Street?
Right. The park actually had been, the day before, the park police had already cleared the immediate park area. When we talk about Lafayette Park, we're talking about a larger area now. And the question was, can they push forward that perimeter in order to establish a fence line? In my view, a court is likely to find that order to be lawful because of the degree of property damage, the injuries to the officers. That order is likely to be upheld. The question is the means used. Was this done properly?
All right, and let me go into that specifically.
Right.
Because there is the allegation floating out there that this was done for a photo op. I think you mentioned something in there. Can you make a firm connection between the actions and the photo op opportunity? Or were they things that just happened to be in a similar time frame?
Well, on the current record, this appears to be a case of correlation without causation. That the Attorney General, the head of the Park Police, and others have said that this plan was actually approved 48 hours in advance. They've presented evidence that the operation itself was delayed because of the fencing and reinforcements that were brought forward, and they have denied knowledge of the photo op when these orders were given.
You got 3 seconds, and you did that very well. Thank you, sir. There may be other questions we have for the record, but my time is up.
Thank you.
Let me recognize Mr. Gallego, Chairman of this, the SCIP subcommittee. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And for the record, I actually have been pepper sprayed. I've done gas mask, all for training in the military, by the way. Pepper sprayed, gas mask training numerous times, probably like 8 times in my life, as well as I have had riot control training with the United States Marine Corps. So I do have some experience both in the uses of batons, formations, as well as the most important thing that they also taught us is de-escalation. Mr. McDonald, what was your MLS when you were in the Navy?
I was a yeoman.
Say again?
I was a yeoman.
Okay. What type of training did you receive in terms of, if any, in terms of dealing with civilian situations?
We didn't really deal with de-escalation. This was 1999. We didn't have a...
Okay, good to know. Well, thank you, first of all, for your service, and thank you for participating in the Black Lives Matter protests, because it does matter. Yes. Mr. Turley, you talked about the legality of the park police being able to clear the area. Do you have background in the necessity or the requirement of de-escalation?
Well, there is training on de-escalation. My only background is, as I know, is counsel in protest cases. Okay. I don't have your experience of dealing directly with things like these chemicals. But all departments that I know of, certainly ones I've encountered, are supposed to be trained in de-escalation. Okay. And that's where it goes to that means. I mean, the area that I think it would be useful for the committee to make an inquiry on really was captured in the video when you see the line move rapidly forward. Right. If I was counsel, I would look at that as to why the line moved, and also at what point was the last warning given before the line moved forward at that rapid pace.
I'll come back to that. Ms. Brace, did you hear any warnings?
No.
When you were attacked by this police officer, were you resisting?
No.
Was your cameraman resisting?
No.
You had your back to them, if I remember, and you were fleeing?
That's correct.
Mr. Turley, as a lawyer, what was that park police officer doing when he was attacking a fleeing protester?
As I've said, I think that attack was unlawful. From the video, it seems clear to me that any officer could have seen that the Australian journalists were in fact journalists. They identified themselves correctly as journalists. I thought I saw media credentials on them, but also they knew that there were journalists in the area. Yep. And so this one doesn't strike me as a very close call. This was...
Thank you, Mr. Turley, and I'm not trying to be rude. I just want to make sure I get more questions in. Mr. McDowell, did you hear any warning sounds?
No.
Okay. Ms. Brace, in the days before that, had you heard warnings before while you were in that protest zone?
Not that I can recall.
Okay. What was the reaction in Australia to this?
There was certainly alarm about what was seen. As I mentioned, the Australian government immediately became involved, contacting the ambassador here and calling for an investigation.
What was the public, though? Australia is one of the Five Eyes, one of the nations that we always share our intelligence with because we trust them so much, because we have fought and bled with them for almost every war since World War I. What was the Australian public thinking when they saw this attack happening?
Well, as I said, it played out live to our audience. There was certainly alarm and concern, which I think then morphed into outrage, obviously, given that Australia also puts the freedom of the press at a level of significant importance.
Thank you. One of the things that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to get a hold of is the training manual for these park police officers, because when I was in the Marine Corps and we did, riot control training, I never would have ever been told to rush forward with your baton swinging. Number one, it escalates the situation to the point where you could create a stampede of people. It's very dangerous. Number two, it actually is tactically stupid to do that because your lines are exposed, right? So the only reason you would actually move in that manner is for pure intimidation, which is not the purpose of a deterrent front, which is what you're trying to do. You're trying to keep people away. As a matter of fact, the way to have done it is to gotten online and move slowly and slowly and slowly. That would have actually allowed the protesters time to understand what's going on. They would have actually had the opportunity to escape, like Mr. Turley said, and probably not have made this illegal. But there was a purpose to this all. And the purpose to this all was to show, quote unquote, law and order for the president before he came out to hold his photo op with the Bible. With that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Fulcher, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in listening to the testimony and seeing the video thus far, it appears like there's no monopoly on blame here. But I would like to I just want to make absolutely certain that we get the entire story. I think we've got a video that shows some assaults on law enforcement. If we have that, could we play that, please?
And another of a man who threw a brick at helmets.
I think that makes a point, Mr. Chairman. We can cut this off here. And hopefully we can solve this microphone issue. In the remaining time, first of all, I've had the opportunity to travel, work, be in a lot of nations around this world, a lot of them where the rule of law is not enjoyed. And generally speaking, their lack of prosperity reflects that. That's why this entire situation is so incredibly troubling to me. I would like to ask Mr. Turley, as unfortunate as it is, from a legal perspective, can you define what peaceful assembly looks like? What are the parameters of that? And where does it cross the line from not being legal?
This touches on the earlier question, where courts tend to define what constitutes peaceful is often as a result of determining qualified immunity decisions. That is, was the officer correct in the use of the level of force in the case? And the courts have said that they defer to officers because of what the court referred to as making split-second judgments that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. That's how the Supreme Court referred to it, I believe, in Graham. So what the courts look at is whether protesters ignored orders to disperse and whether they were obstructive or violent. And this gets to that critical period, which I think this committee is going to have to look at, of that period after the warnings were given, before the line moved forward. What were those officers facing. And that's what a court will do. And a court is going to demand very clear evidence on both sides to determine whether that could be defined as a peaceful situation where this is not warranted, and the police escalated it, or whether they were responding to a threat to their safety or the safety of others.
Thank you for that. And then just quickly, there's one other thing I'd just like you to address with us, if you could. Assuming we can get some good dialogue, some peaceful dialogue here, step us through very quickly the legal process for how should we be doing this? If we want to change some of these monuments, how should we be doing that?
Well, first of all, there's been great suggestions in both houses about police reforms, including having a national database and the issues that many of us have raised in the past. But in terms of this incident, I gave 10 questions that would be a useful start for this committee. It would get you the base information you need, including actual contemporary calls made by officers, the so-called running resume evidence. In a protest case, that's the first thing we ask for, is the running resume. Also, you have objective sources in the claims of injuries to law enforcement officers, injuries to protesters. Those things can be acquired. The other thing that I encourage you to get at very quickly is non-U.S. Park Police agencies and their roles. I can tell you in terms of evidence, that's the stuff I'm most concerned with. It is the stuff that's most difficult to get. And you may be able to get a lead on that by asking for what are called MOUs. And MOUs, these memorandums of understanding, are often cut with non-federal agencies or non-park police personnel. Those may give you an indication of who was involved at that scene. I can tell you in the Pershing Park case, we started out with the Park Police, the DC Police, the Secret Service, and ended up with a long list of units that we had no idea were present.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Cox, Chairman of the Subcommittee, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all the witnesses for being here today. I want to say, Reverend Bundy, thank you so much for your statement and your testimony. I think you may have turned a Catholic into an Episcopalian today. Because I tell you what, I am certainly here as a role of member of Congress because my faith, as you said so eloquently, to seek justice, equal justice for all people. So thank you so much for that. And I want to apologize on behalf of the committee if you were called a vandal, an arsonist, or other pejorative. Likewise, Mr. McDonald and Ms. Brace as well, because you were there at Lafayette Square on June 1st. And Mr. McDonald, I want to thank you for your service in the United States Navy. And I'm sure when you enlisted, you took a very similar oath of office that we did when we took the oath of office to be a member of Congress, to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. And in that first article, where the Congress will make no law to abridge the freedom of speech or of the press or the right for people to peacefully assemble. And if you could say why you were there that day to peacefully assemble.
I share the same views at the Black Lives Matter movement, and everyone was down there. On June 1st, it was a peaceful protest. From the minute I got down there to the minute we were attacked. We were chanting for injustice. We didn't hear any warnings to move. And I was there strictly to peaceful protest for my voice to be heard.
You were exercising your rights, your constitutional rights,
yes,
as a citizen, that you had sworn previously to uphold, and now we're exercising those. And do you feel that those were abridged that day?
Can you say that again?
Do you feel that those rights were infringed upon that day?
Yes, most definitely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And as an objective citizen from another country, Ms. Brace, is that what you saw as well?
Yes, it is.
You know, and I guess Professor Turley, is that I also sit on the Ag Committee, and you know, I've been taught that if something looks like a duck and sounds like a duck and walks like a duck, it's probably a duck, all right? And the idea that the White House had no idea that day that the park had to be cleared is beyond the pale. Just all of a sudden that the president is making a speech as I'm going to do something right away, and lo and behold, the park is cleared. Would he have gone out there to have his photo op if the park hadn't been cleared?
You know, what I suggest in my testimony is, first of all, I do think you need to establish that, and you can establish that. The account from the Attorney General and others is that the order the plan was approved in the morning on Monday, the order was issued at 2, there was a delay on fencing and National Guardsmen, all that can be confirmed by this committee. But that doesn't necessarily answer the question, as I raised in my testimony. What I would be more interested in, unless all those are lies, would be, was there any last-minute discussion as to whether this should be delayed? In my view, it should have been delayed. It should have been delayed to the following morning. But it's at that juncture, that twilight moment, if I was counsel, that's what I would be looking at. And also, I would be looking at whether the perimeter size pushed to I Street was impacted by anyone suggesting the needs of the photo op. All of that should be attainable by the committee.
And we will look at that. So thank you so much. And we've seen video from the other side of Los Angeles and New York and Chicago, and video on May 31st and June 26th. Is that at all relevant to the peaceful protest that was going on June 1st?
No, I don't think a court would take that in consideration. A court would consider what happened in Lafayette Park in the area the day before.
How about the day of?
No, the day of is the most important criteria. There's no question the court will be looking at the conditions.
There were painters in the park.
Right.
There were clergy offering medical support and
the
trains.
Court would be, yeah, the court would be looking at
the kumbaya moment. I think it was the textbook definition of a peaceful assembly.
Yeah, I think that the way the court would look at it is that what happened the day before justified the order to clear the park and establish the fencing, including the wider perimeter. But then the court, I think, would focus on what was actually happening at that moment as to whether the level of force deployed was lawful and reasonable. And that's where your point, I think, is a salient one. You know, and that's where I think this committee could make some real progress in defining.
Thank you so much, and I do have other questions about the secret police, but we'll have to get to those at another date. I yield.
Gentleman yields. Let me recognize Mr. Gober. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all the witnesses being here. Nobody could see the video of George Floyd being killed and not be very moved. No question about that. And I greatly appreciate the Floyd family urging peaceful protests and not violence. That's not what they wanted for George's legacy. So there are important issues that need to be addressed here. Mr. McDonald, thank you for your service in the Navy to our country. I see from your statement the ship you were stationed on. How long were you in the Navy?
9 months.
9 months. That's good. Did you run into prejudice in the Navy? Racial prejudice?
No, I did not.
Okay. In your statement, you had mentioned that the police stopped pushing forward at the urging of protesters when a man had fallen there and was being given aid, and that they began using less lethal force. What was the difference in force before and after the individual fell?
You talking about the black man that fell in my statement?
Yes.
Yeah, he fell, and we asked the police to stop. At that moment, they established a perimeter.
Right.
Maybe enough for like 10 seconds for us to get him up and move him. But the minute we got him up and moved him, they started running at us. They didn't stop to help us.
But what force were they using at that time?
Their batons and their shields.
Baton and shield?
Yes.
Okay. And Ms. Brace, obviously that had to have been rather traumatic. And obviously you and your cameraman came prepared with the goggles. With your experience, you've been in a lot of protests, apparently around the world, and appreciate your coverage. And having looked back just through June 8th, apparently, just through June 8th, there had been 17 people died in incidents stemming from the unrest from George Floyd's death, including David Dorn, David McAtee, Chris Beatty, Dorian Morrell, Italia Kelly. Of course, I don't know, anybody could not be moved seeing her sister saying, you know, she wasn't shot by the police. It was one of you, it was one of the protesters. When protests get out of hand, people get hurt. You're far more experienced in these type of protests. Is there a point at which you can tell this is about to turn violent at protests?
You can never be certain, obviously. You can certainly feel, I guess, tension rising in protests. In saying that, I certainly have never had any reason to expect violence from the police as working press.
But when things get crazy at a protest, you can't be sure, like seeing those bricks being thrown at police recently. If you're a civilian in the way, just like Italia Kelly, you may be hit by a protester's brick. It's got to be hard to tell.
I saw nothing on June 1st that made me feel in any way alarmed before that line of police surged forward.
Yeah. Were you out at the protest the night that St. John's had a fire started?
Yes, the night of May 31.
Did you see how anybody got into the church to start the fires?
No, I didn't.
Could you understand why law enforcement might be concerned about others getting into the church, either legally or illegally, to cause more damage?
I obviously can't speak to the motivation of the police, but as your colleague, Mr. McClintock, pointed out, there is an importance of distinction. I have said in my statement that the night before I did see much more widespread chaos, but on the day of June the 1st, in question at the moment, I did not see anything that warranted the movement of police that we witnessed.
And thank you. And Bishop Budde, I appreciate your effort at social justice. What do you think is the hope for those in Washington, D.C. that are protesting?
I can't speak for all protesters, but I think the moniker Black Lives Matter is the way we are expressing a collective cry that we have equity in our policing, that Black and brown persons can expect the same level of treatment and safety when they are encountering police, and that we have a reckoning in this country for all manner of policies and practices that would cause Black and brown people in this country to fear for their lives when encountering the very people who are meant to keep them safe.
Hey, thank you, Bishop, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was an African-American minister that said our hope is in Jesus Christ. I yield back.
Gentleman yields, and let me recognize the gentlelady from New Mexico, the chair of the Public Lands Subcommittee, Ms. Howard. You recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for convening today's panel. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Our colleagues have said it already, but the events of June 1st will no doubt go down as one of the darkest days of this presidency. And that's saying something for a president who has put children in cages, protected his friends from prosecution, and opened our elections to foreign interference. Attacks on the Constitution aren't new for this president, but clearing a peaceful demonstration for a photo op with his cabinet is an unbelievably new low. While we will rightly focus on those actions of June 1st, we cannot lose sight of the larger moment that we are all in. Today's hearing is also about a larger trend of systemic racism in which militarized police intimidate and kill in communities of color while defended from prosecution. The president's recent actions brought that excessive force to the fore in a new and unconstitutional way. But this is by no means an isolated incident. And while I respect the work federal civil servants do every single day, there are times they do things our nation is not proud of. In November 2017, the U.S. Park Police murdered Bijan Gaisar just over the river in Arlington while he drove his car. Still, his family has not had justice. Earlier this year in my state of New Mexico, Charles Gage Lawrence was driving back to his home in Colorado when he was murdered by a U.S. park ranger on one of our national parks. I spoke to his mother's attorney recently, but I couldn't explain why that killer still patrolled one of our national parks and why he hadn't been brought to justice. Today, we are here to talk about the president and his illegal and unconstitutional actions. But we also need to discuss power, to discuss fear, to discuss unequal treatment under the law. Because we did not choose to live in a society where the president wields the power of our government to break up peaceful protests any more than communities of color across this nation choose to live in fear of unequal policing. Let's try to understand what breakdown in norms led to this horrible injustice of the clearing of Lafayette Square on June 1st. But let's also make sure we keep in mind the culture of systemic oppression that allows the same fear and power to control and kill in communities across our country. Because, as I have stated, this was not an isolated incident. Mr. McDonald and Ms. Brace, and Mr. McDonald, you can go first, and then Ms. Brace. At any time, did you see any park police or law enforcement officers stop or double back to provide medical assistance or facilitate medical assistance when somebody was clearly injured? Ms. Brace?
No, I did not.
And again, Mr. McDonald and Ms. Brace, do you expect law enforcement to provide basic care and or call medical assistance when someone is hurt?
Yes, I do.
And Mr. McDonald and Ms. Brace, why do you have that expectation? I'm sorry?
Public.
Again, I would expect the police to protect civilians and also working media.
Thank you so much. In fact, part of the mission of the United States National Park Police is to protect lives. It is to protect lives. That's part of their mission, is to protect lives. So I appreciate all of you being here today. The Right Reverend MARIANN, thank you so much for your calmness, for your heart, and for your leadership in this troubled time. I appreciate it very much. And Chairman, I yield.
Recognize Mr. Westerman for your comments, sir. Questions? Mr. Lamborn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's see, a couple of my friends and colleagues on the other side of the aisle have talked about how the park police wasn't here to present any statement or facts, and yet I've been led to believe that they were constrained from being here because, like Assistant Chief Monahan said in a letter to you, Mr. Chairman, that to be on the same panel with a person who is suing them in a case of active litigation would be make him legally constrained and not able to testify at the same time. So I wish you could have structured this hearing today where that was not an impediment to hearing from the park police. I think that would have been very helpful. And so that's what I ascribe their absence to, is the legal constraints. And Mr. McDonald, you have filed suit against the Department of Interior and other parties, haven't you, seeking money damages?
Going against Trump, violation of our First Amendment rights.
Okay, and that includes the Department of the Interior.
The ACLU has a lawsuit I'm part of.
Okay.
For violation of our First Amendment rights.
Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, I wish you could have structured things so that we could have heard from all of the interested parties here today. Secondly, I would like to ask unanimous consent to have inserted into the record a letter from the Fraternal Order of Police, United States Park Police Labor Committee, dated June 19th. This letter was sent to the editor of the Washington Post, but they have not seen fit to print this letter, but it explains some things from the perspective of the police on the Park Police force. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to insert this in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Okay, and then thirdly, I'd like to talk about attacks on journalists. I went to journalism school myself, so I'm not happy to hear about attacks on journalists, whether it's from police or whether it's from protesters. You know, journalists should be able to do their job. So I would like to play a video called Assaults on Journalists.
When you go cover these protests, you're expecting perhaps for there to be violence, especially when there's going to be clashes with police. But this was different. We were really targeted. Our crew and I. Of Lafayette Park there. There were 50 or 60 people who no longer yelling at President Trump. We're talking about that. They came out after us, chased us out, took our camera, smashed our camera, took my microphone, threw it at me. We took a lot of body shots. It was the most scary since being chased out of Unclear Square by a group from the Muslim Brotherhood. It was.
Protesters is something that should not be part of a peaceful protest. Ms. Brace?
Yes, of course.
Mr. Turley?
Yes.
And Mr. McDonald? Okay. And Mr. Turley, how would incidents like we saw in the video where journalists are being attacked by protesters turned into rioters affect the legality of a decision to disperse the protesters?
Well, any violence at the area of Lafayette Square is going to be considered by a court as a part of the justification for expanding the perimeter, for setting up the fence, for clearing the area. There was a high level of violence that was being reported by the Park Police. 50 officers is a lot of officers to be injured, I got to tell you, in a protest case. And if it's as high as 100, that's pretty high. And there was obviously some arson, there was damage to property. I think a court would conclude that the protests through that 3-day period were not entirely peaceful, and that law enforcement was facing threats. Now, as the member earlier alluded to, the court, in looking at the means used to push back the line, will look specifically at the level of violence at that time. And so I think the court's going to consider both. The whole context, in other words, of the level of violence.
My time's up, Mr. Chairman. Can I also insert into the record with unanimous consent the letter dated June 24th to you from the Department of Interior explaining Mr. Monahan's ability to testify or not?
Let me recognize Ms. Napolitano for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a question for Ms. Brace. Ms. Brace, did you have a lanyard with the media in big words identifying you as media?
I couldn't hear the question.
I'm sorry, could you please repeat that question?
Did you have an identification in the front with a lanyard identifying you as media?
No, we don't like to wear press passes around our necks for safety reasons.
Okay. Did you hear them use a bullhorn to disperse people at all?
No, I did not.
Reverend Budde, the square is very adjacent to your church, am I correct?
That's correct.
Have you ever seen that entire area forcibly cleared like it was on June 1st?
No, I have not.
Do you have an idea why your church was chosen to focus on racial injustice in particular?
My sense, I mean, St. John's Lafayette Square has been a place of protest historically in the nation's capital for many years, due to its proximity to the White House and to the public space of the actual park where people have been allowed to peacefully protest.
Your church has decided to champion racial injustice. Why do you feel this is important to the people? Is it because of the proximity to the White House?
Well, we took advantage of the proximity of the White House to add our voice to the protest that was gathered there. All of our congregations across the city and indeed the entire diocese are committed to racial justice in their own context and in their own ways.
Well, I commend you for that because it is very important. All lives matter. It's just important that we recognize that the injustices to all people of color have been going on for many generations, and nothing's going to stop it until the word and the change must come from the top, and apparently we don't have the will at the top to do that. And then as President Trump stood for his photo op in front of your church, holding his Bible, and didn't bother to open or read from it. What went through your mind when you saw that?
I was, as I've said before, I was outraged, and I felt that it was a misuse of both the space and the Bible for him to claim in that moment, having just said what was said in the Rose Garden and witnessed what we witnessed in the park. I felt as if he was putting on a mantle of spiritual authority to justify those actions.
Has he issued any memo or any letter or any phone call to you apologizing?
No.
It is important for us to recognize that this isn't the first time and probably not the last time that we will have injustices towards people of color. What do you think that the government must do to anybody to start the motion to rectify this, to instruct officers at the top level and the work to come down for a change in attempting to deal with racial issues?
Well, thank you for asking. It's not my expertise to weigh in on how the policy should be changed, but at the very minimum, there should be equity and full responsibility for illegal actions, no matter who is at fault, and that our Black and brown fellow citizens should be able to feel the same degree of security and safety that white Americans feel when encountering the police.
Ms. Brace?
Again, I don't presume to come here to tell the American people how to run their police force or the government, but I would expect for peaceful protesters to be allowed to peacefully protest and for the media to be able to safely cover such events.
Mr. McDonald?
I think the bottom line is just respect the Constitution and how it was drafted up, and I think we won't have a problem with overall policing. I'm here to talk about what happened June 1st, and they were just honored our rights to peacefully protest and freedom of assembly. We won't have any issue at all.
Well, thank you all for testifying, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Let me recognize Mr. Westerman. Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I can say that as I heard your personal testimony, it angers me to think what happened to you and your firsthand account of the things that went on. And part of the function of oversight is to make sure that that the law is being carried out, that justice is administered, and if it's not, that we rectify that. So it's important to have oversight hearings like this. I also realize that your firsthand accounts were bits and pieces of a bigger story. And I think that there's more for us to learn that we can't learn from the meeting here today. And I think there's voices that aren't being heard, and we need to hear all voices and find out where the real problems are. I have a letter here from the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association. It says, while otherwise peaceful protests were co-opted by radical groups focused on destruction versus dialogue, federal law enforcement officers were thrust into roles of protecting and preserving the safety of not only city streets, but also our nation's monuments and our history that we all hold dear. They went on to further say, no clearer was that role than here in Washington, D.C., where Lafayette Park was besieged by radical and violent groups of individuals. These are the same individuals that set fire to and vandalized St. John's Church, attacked and vandalized monuments in and around our nation's capital, including the World War II Memorial, a tribute to an entire generation of Americans that kept our world free, and then attacked the very law enforcement officers that were originally sent there to monitor and ensure the safety of the individuals peacefully assembled. Much of this work fell to the officers of the U.S. Park Police. These brave men and women came under daily, almost hourly attacks from unpeaceful and violent rioters and were constantly pelted with frozen bottles of urine, fireworks, bricks, stones, street pavers, and all manner of other unknown substances. Other federal law enforcement officers, including the Uniform Division of the Secret Service, various DOJ entities, and officers from the Metropolitan Police Department joined the U.S. Park Police at times to try and quell the violence, stop the destruction, and allow the voices of the peaceful protesters to be heard. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit this to the record. Mr. Lamborn referred to a letter or an op-ed from the Fraternal Order of Police. It was denied publishing in the Washington Post to counter an article that the Post put out. And they said here that over the weekend, 51 U.S. Park Police officers required medical treatment for injuries sustained on duty, and it goes on and on. What I'm saying is there's another side of this story, and we need to hear all of that. And there's an investigation being taken on by Internal Affairs at the Park Police and also by the Inspector General of the Department of Interior. I wish we could have waited until we had that evidence and we could get more witnesses here to be heard. That being said, I have no reason to doubt what you're saying. And I think we've got to take an open look at these things going forward. Mr. Turley, if indeed those members of the Park Police were injured, transported to hospital, all these things going on, in your opinion, was it legal for the Park Police to clear Lafayette Park?
I think a court would likely say that it was a lawful order to clear the park. As I say in my testimony, they had all the elements, particularly if they gave the 3 warnings and an opportunity to disperse. That doesn't answer this secondary question of the level or means used. I also have to say that when I saw the figures of the 50 injured Park Police officers, the claim of 100 injured federal officers, I was quite surprised. That is a very high number of injuries. So I think a court would probably approach this question without saying that this was an entirely peaceful protest. To the contrary, I think the court would recognize that there were security issues that were valid for the administration. I think the court would likely say that the original order was lawful and then would focus in, as I talked about, in that critical period. And what concerns me the most is that critical period when the line moved.
We have to move on here. So finally, when we talk about the Christian thing to do, certainly to work for justice and equality, I believe that. I try to practice what the Bible teaches. But it also talks about being in subjection to governing authorities. Paul said that. Peter said to submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Even Jesus, when he was prodded to rebel against the government, said to render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's. And I would just like to ask the bishop, do you believe it's a Christian's duty when working for justice and equality to follow the law and submit to those in authority and condemn violence and unlawful acts such as rioting and arson?
I absolutely believe that it is necessary to condemn violence and arson, but I also would take issue at an interpretation of Scripture that does not include the long legacy of the struggle for liberation and freedom, and the opportunity when given time and time again. The Scripture tells us that we must obey the laws of God and not the laws of men, especially when they are unjust. And so, particularly in a democracy, we have a fundamental responsibility to ensure that the laws are just and that they are justly enforced by those who are entrusted with the sacred responsibility of overseeing the governance of our people.
Are you saying laws against violence and arson are unjust?
I am not.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Let me recognize Mr. Levin for his comments. Questions?
Thank you, Chair Grijalva, and thank you to today's witnesses. In particular, I want to thank you, Bishop Budde, for your testimony. My family attends St. Margaret's Episcopal Church in San Juan Capistrano, California, so it's very meaningful to have you here today. Chair Grijalva, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record a Washington Post article contributed by Reverend Ginny Gerbasi, the rector at St. John's Episcopal Church in Georgetown. Bishop Budde, as you know, Reverend Gerbasi was at St. John's Church in Lafayette Square the evening of June 1st. Her description of the scene is powerful. As she wrote, she got to the church around 4:00 p.m. that day to, as she puts it, offer peaceful and prayerful support to the protesters. She describes the scene as upbeat and peaceful. She wrote, quote, "My colleagues and I passed out water and snacks. People exchanged prayers and elbow bumps. Things were so calm that by 6:00 p.m., most of my colleagues had left." Bishop Budde, do you have any reason to believe that Reverend Gerbasi was not being truthful in her description?
Absolutely none.
Mr. McDonald and Ms. Brace, does this description generally align with the scene you saw as well?
Yes, it does.
Mr. McDonald and Ms. Brace, did any of the videos my Republican colleagues played look like the scene at Lafayette Square on June 1st before police attacked?
No, it did not.
No, they did not.
In fact, as Reverend Gerbasi writes on, we see that the scene of peace and camaraderie dramatically changes around 6:15 p.m. as the officers move from Lafayette Park into the street. After hearing the first loud bang of a flash grenade, she describes, and I quote, yelling and panic. And then she says, and I quote, "I couldn't believe my eyes. A wall of police, full riot gear, was physically pushing people off the St. John's patio, maybe 15 feet away from me." So we have a firsthand account of U.S. Park Police answering peaceful protests with brutality, which was the subject of the protests to begin with. Bishop Budde, when you heard that Reverend Gerbasi and her colleagues were being physically pushed off St. John's patio, what went through your mind?
I was stunned and horrified and concerned for their safety and the safety of all those who were gathered. And like others who have expressed their civic response, I was outraged that the Park Police and others were acting in that manner.
Reverend Gerbasi went on to describe President Trump's photo op with the Bible. She called it, and I quote, sacrilege. Would you agree with that statement?
I've thought about that, and yes, I would. Because
Why?
Because it was taking something sacred and misusing it in a and misapplying its message to justify something that was violent and that was abusive, abuse of power. And there's nothing in the scriptures that would condone that behavior.
Thank you, Bishop. Ms. Brace, I'd like to turn to you. Thank you for your testimony. And as you note, the video of you and your cameraman being violently attacked speaks louder than words. Since being sworn into office and taking his oath to protect the Constitution of the United States, this president has repeatedly attacked the free press, calling the media, quote, the enemy of the people, limiting access to his press conferences, filing libel lawsuits, and sending cease and desist letters about news stories he doesn't like. The list goes on and on. On June 1st, Park Police violently attacked you and your cameraman, as we saw, despite you clearly identifying yourselves as members of the press and having news gathering equipment. Do you believe that the president's rhetoric and actions towards the free press has impacted the way the media has been treated by law enforcement?
I can't speak to the motivation of members of law enforcement here in the United States. I can certainly say that there has been a noticeable trend in the treatment of the media by members of the police force, both the example of myself and Tim. My fiance was working in Minneapolis as a member of the Congressional press, and he was arrested while working legally. We've seen a number of other instances across the country where the press has been targeted, even just during these protesters, by members of the police. So while I can't say why that is happening, it's certainly what I see as a trend, and that is very worrying for a free press.
And do you believe this will have lasting impacts on journalism in the United States and abroad?
I think anything that deters journalists from being able to do their job safely could deter people from becoming journalists or doing their jobs without fear or favour, which is exactly what we're meant to be doing.
Thank you, Ms. Brace. In the words of my friend, the late Elijah Cummings, we are better than this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Let me recognize gentlelady from Puerto Rico, Ms. Gonzalez Colon. The time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to yield my time.
To whom?
Who did she yield to?
Oh, me? Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate witnesses. Mr. Lacey, you notice what I am doing. This is specifically for you. Oh, good. But it's specifically for you. If you can find a cardinal one, you can do that. I just have two quick questions to ask. As I was sitting here listening to the testimony, I started reading, Ms. Brace, some of your testimony here in which you simply said, having seen the nature of the protests on May 31st, you and your cameraman purchased protective equipment, eyewear specifically. Is that accurate? Now, was that for one specific instance, or was it for a series of events, or was it simply a trend that you saw?
We purchased our eyewear on the 31st of May, so before we were covering the protests that day.
Was it for a specific incident or a trend?
I would say it's because of what we'd seen in Minneapolis earlier in the week.
I'll accept that as a trend then. Can I then ask one other question? Because I found it interesting when Ms. Napolitano, who asked you, and she's no longer here, but if you were wearing a lanyard and you said no, did you indeed say that you don't want to identify yourself as media for fear of protection?
No, I did not say that.
What did you actually say to her? Why did you not wear the media? Why did you not emphasize yourself or identify yourself as media with a lanyard or something? What did you actually tell her?
I did have my State Department press identification. I don't like to wear it around my neck for safety reasons because it's something that can be pulled in a protest.
All right. That's, I'm sorry, that was just interesting and fascinating to me. Mr. Turley, I have one last thing to ask you at the same time. As I was looking more at the stuff that we put into the record from the Interior Department, so according to the department, the LRAD used by the Park Service is a 100X model. Hopefully it means something to you. It doesn't mean anything to me. But it means it's 20 to 30 decibels louder than typical bullhorn or vehicle-based PA system. So the model that was used has a maximum range of about 2,000 feet with a peak output of 140 decibels. To compare that, a jet engine produces 140 decibels at 100 feet, produces 140 decibels. So that's the size of it. Department informed the committee staff that the script read as follows. This is Major Mark Adamczyk with the United States Park Police. For safety and security reasons, Lafayette Park and H Street are closed to pedestrians. You are ordered to depart the area immediately. This is your first warning. And they said that there were 2 more warnings like this one given. The last one stated this was a final warning. According to legal standards that you've been talking about, is that warning sufficient to satisfy the warning requirements of law before dispersing demonstrators like they did on June 1st?
It is sufficient, and in fact, in my testimony, I suggested that the LRAD may have been used. I noted in the testimony that the Park Police has the LRAD system. It is a huge improvement over prior years where they would use the PA systems off of patrol cars. This has a much broader range by magnitude of dozens in terms of the penetration of that system. It doesn't mean that you can't have canceling noise in a protest, particularly if you've got objects around you, but that is the gold standard for amplification in these types of situations.
So it is much easier to hear than simply a bullhorn would have been. And then one of the questions
that is the recommended, that's recommended system for many civil libertarians. It is a system that has a very significant penetration range. Now, that doesn't mean, once again, that you don't have circumstances where I entirely understand where people might not have heard it. You can have people around you, they could be screaming in your ear. Those are canceling noises. But this really is the gold standard in terms of the use of amplification.
All right, and you got 30 seconds for this one. If someone heard a statement from a policeman saying, move, move, is that the kind of legal qualification that would be used?
When an officer tells you to move back, particularly after these warnings, you are expected to comply.
All right, so if somebody in their written testimony would say they heard the officer say move, move, that would be the legal justification to have, and the expectation of lawful citizens that they would then move.
Yes, you are expected to follow the orders of the officers, particularly after the issuance of those warnings.
Thank you. I thank the gentlelady from Puerto Rico. I hope things are going well for you down there, for yielding. Mr. Grijalva, yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Mr. DeGoose, you're recognized, sir.
What?
Huh?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for this committee and this Congress to effectively fulfill our oversight duties. We absolutely must have a detailed understanding of the events that unfolded earlier this month. And so I thank each of the witnesses for appearing today and for your testimony. I want to ask a question of Ms. Brace. I wonder if you could share what your reaction was when you heard that the U.S. Park Police acting chief stated that the, quote, USPP officers and other assisting law enforcement partners did not use tear gas or OC scat shells to close the area at Lafayette Park, end quote, despite your experience being the opposite.
Well, I'm obviously no expert in ballistics or the use of gas, particularly what was used, but I am certain that there was a chemical irritant used, and I was certainly hit by some sort of non-lethal projectile, so that is completely the opposite of my experience.
Do you have any concerns that if journalists and others who were there who, if they had not, rather, shared photos of empty OC and CS canisters and videos of what had occurred, that we may not have known the truth?
In that instance, I guess we would be relying on first-hand accounts. Also, in our recording, our video, you can hear the use of automatic weapons, which again goes to what I was saying.
Well, it certainly underscores why a hearing like this is so important and why it's important to hear from folks who have first-hand accounts as to what happened late last month. I also want to register my displeasure with the lack of a witness from the executive branch that's testifying before our committee today. I read, with much respect to my friend, my good friend from Colorado, I did read the letter that was sent to Chairman Grijalva from the Department of Interior dated June 24th, 2020. And I think it's important to clarify for the record, while this letter does intimate an expectation that the executive branch witness would be provided a separate panel, that is not the reason for the declination of appearing to testify before this committee. Ostensibly, what they purport as the justification for declining to appear before this committee is timing, that they're too busy, and that they'll therefore, consider appearing later in the month in mid or late July. And so I guess I wonder whether the panelists have any thoughts, perhaps Mr. Turley, or Professor Turley, I should say, you think it's reasonable for this committee to expect to be able to hear from the assistant chief or another relevant witness from the executive branch?
Absolutely. I think this committee should ascertain a number of the facts that I pointed out, which will be the first facts that the courts isolate. There's a number of these facts which will be determinative in any review of this conduct, and that includes what was used at the scene. This became a sort of colloquial versus technical debate as to what constitutes tear gas. The Park Police's later statement was correct. The impact on an individual is going to be much the same. It's an irritant, and courts have often grouped them together as to when you can use this. I personally believe that as this committee drills down, it's going to find itself more and more focused on that twilight period when you see that charge. That's a charge. That's a line charging. And so the question is, was that warranted in that circumstance?
So I think, I agree with you, Professor Turley, with respect to the need for this committee to engage in that inquiry. And I must confess, I'm less than optimistic that we will have as much success as perhaps the judicial system will in terms of potentially deposing some of these administration witnesses, because the track record of the 116th Congress in terms of its ability to get executive branch witnesses to appear before the Congress is less than stellar. With a Secretary of Defense who's refusing to appear before the Armed Services Committee to talk about this particular set of issues, with a Secretary of State who declines to appear before the Foreign Affairs Committee. Of course, you may remember we've had an exchange previously, 8, 9 some odd months ago before the Judiciary Committee during the impeachment process about obstruction of Congress and the lack of any ability to, again, get these witnesses before the legislative branch. And so I fear, I must say, because as I read this letter, it is part and parcel to this pattern that this administration has pursued relentlessly since the days that I was sworn into Congress. And I would hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would join us in our effort to, again, get to the bottom of it and have folks from the administration testify. Because invariably, and I think as you've referenced in the past, administrations change, right? We have elections, and at the end of the day, there may very well be another administration and a Congress that is hoping to seek witnesses from that particular administration. And I would hope that we could treat these issues with the respect that they deserve. And so with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Next, Ms. DeGette, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I've been here at this hearing since the very beginning, and it's very important, and it's important to hear from our witnesses. Like all of us, I've been shocked by the unrestrained use of force by the federal law enforcement agencies. And we're here today because one of those agencies, the Park Police, violated its own use of force policies in following President Trump's directive to clear Lafayette Square. Mr. Chairman, your staff has a copy of the U.S. Park Police's use of force policy, General Order 3615, updated November 1, 2019, and I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to enter that into the record right now.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This policy governs the conditions under which the Park Police's use of force is appropriate. Ms. Brace and Mr. McDonald, I want to ask you about some of the parts of this policy and whether they're consistent with what you saw on July 1st. And I would appreciate yes or no answers if you're able. The policy, which was updated last fall, says, quote, an officer is expected to employ only the minimum level of responsible force necessary to control a situation. Now, Ms. Brace, I believe you testified that you have covered a number of demonstrations. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, so in your experience being at that protest, did you view the U.S. Park Police and other law enforcement officers employing only the minimum level of reasonable force necessary to control the situation?
No, I don't.
Now, the policy also says, Mr. McDonald, I want to ask you the same question. You testified that you served in the military, and so I assume you've seen people using force. I want to ask you, did you view the U.S. Park Police and other law enforcement employing only the minimum level of reasonable force necessary to control the situation? I'm sorry, sir, I can't hear you. Could you? There.
I believe they use excessive force.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Brace and Mr. McDonald, did either of you see a situation where Park Police use of force seemed to be required, and then did they stop it once it didn't seem to be required? Ms. Brace, we'll start with you.
No, not that I saw.
Mr. McDonald?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. The policy says an officer shall, or wait, my question is, did either of you see a situation where they seemed to need to use the force and then they stopped it once it wasn't required anymore?
No, I did not.
Okay. The policy also says an officer shall, if possible, first attempt to diffuse a situation through advice, warning, verbal persuasion, tactical communication, and other de-escalation and conflict negotiation techniques. Ms. Brace, did you see the police doing anything like that?
No, I did not.
Mr. McDonald?
No, I did not.
Finally, the policy says the goal of de-escalation tactics is to gain the voluntary compliance of a subject when appropriate and consistent with personal safety to reduce or eliminate the necessity to use force. Ms. Brace, did you see the police doing that?
No, I did not.
And how about you, Mr. McDonald?
No, I did not.
Now, did you see anybody at that particular protest who was not complying voluntarily?
No, ma'am.
Not from what I saw.
Were each of you complying voluntarily?
Yes, I was.
Yes.
Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, just looking at the U.S. Park Police's use of force policy, it seems to me that they were violating their very own policy, which is what the purpose of this hearing is. And I find it very telling that the administration didn't even show up to explain any of this today. I just want to take one more minute of personal privilege and, Bishop, tell you how proud I am of you as a woman of God to stand up for the right of peaceful protesters. I'm a Presbyterian in Denver, and my church is very involved with the Black Lives Matter movement, and we are involved in these protests, and we think that's part of the very fabric of Christianity and the very fabric of America. So thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Let me recognize Mr. Clay. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for conducting this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony in observance of what you saw that day. My wife and I happened to be in our living room watching incredulously, especially after Attorney General Barr went out to the square to survey and then ordered the clearing of that square. How outrageous, how un-American, just so somebody could take a photo op. Let me ask you, Mr. McDonald, let me first thank you for your service to this country and for your activism. Giving your testimony from what you saw on that day, did you see any protesters act violent, or did you see any of the demonstrators throw projectiles at law enforcement?
No, I didn't see anyone throwing anything. I didn't see anyone acting violent.
Thank you for that. And for a, like me, for a black man who served this country, when you hear this administration and president say time after time that he does a lot for the black community, then to be treated like a hostile, what goes through your mind?
I mean, it fits the rhetoric where the black man feels like he always persecuted. I'm out there for a just reason. And I have an administration, not just administration, a government that's trying to clear me for exercising my First Amendment rights.
Thank you for that. And let's put politics aside. Does the president's narrative seem consistent if peaceful demonstrators cannot peacefully protest the racial injustices we see and face on a daily basis?
I think for the probably last 10 protests have been very peaceful. We have demonstrated, the whole world has seen us peacefully protest. I think those rioters and all that stuff was isolated incidents. 90% of the protests I've been to, well, 100% I've been to, has been positive, and about 90% I've seen on TV has been very positive.
Having a military background, do you consider the training of those law enforcement personnel that you came up against on June 1st to be in a posture of warrior or guardian?
Warrior.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Ms. Brace, have you covered other protests where you've experienced law enforcement treating media in a similar manner to your experience in Black Lives Matter Square?
No, I have not.
You have not. And as has already been mentioned, this administration's story around what happened that day and why it happened keeps changing. When you hear the administration's changing explanations, what goes through your mind as a journalist?
Well, obviously, I'm here to observe what's happening, not to speculate on why it's happening. All I can tell you is on that day, on June 1st, the plan seemed to change because we were expecting the curfew to be enforced at 7 p.m. and it was enforced at 6:30 p.m.
And during your broadcast, you mentioned that the police were being indiscriminate and didn't seem to change their actions after you stated you were members of the media. Do you think at all that the treatment of you was intentionally directed at you due to your status as a journalist?
I can't say whether we were targeted because we were working press. I can say it was clear we were working press. And even after my cameraman, Tim Myers, was assaulted and it was acknowledged very clearly that we were press, I was then hit across the back with a truncheon as I was trying to move away as directed.
Did you say that you got hit with a projectile?
Yes.
Oh, a rubber bullet.
I'm not sure whether it was a rubber bullet, it was a projectile, a non-lethal bullet.
I see. Mr. McDonald, did you get hit with an
Yes,
object?
I got a plume of tear gas. One exploded right below my feet, and they threw a flash grenade right at my ankles to the point it exploded. When I felt all the pellets, I asked the officer on film, I said, "What did you throw at me?" And I seen something like smoke from the ground, and I correlated both together. I said, whatever you threw, did it blow up on the ground and the asphalt hit me? And I thought like it may hit, because the loud sound, I was oblivious to what it was. When it hit the ground, I just felt something hit me. And I thought it was the asphalt, like it was that powerful where it blew the asphalt up. And I asked him, what was that?
Wow. My time is up, but this is not how civilians in this nation should be treated who are trying to exercise their constitutional rights. And I defy anyone on this panel to refute that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Let me now recognize Ms. Dingell for your 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member, who it's always good to see. I want to thank you both for having these hearings. And I think it's really important to say as we start this that I don't think any person on either side of this aisle thinks that violence is ever okay at a protest. And I don't think you see people here saying that. And I want to say that to some of my Republican colleagues. I have actually been in the woman who you couldn't force out of her house 3 weeks ago, have been at 17 vigil marches and protests in the last 2 weeks because the people of my communities organized them. And so, some are areas that do them all the time, and some are ones that do them none of the time. And the first ones that I went downriver, that were most of them were organized by young people. One of my police chiefs immediately said to me, "What are you doing here?" And not because he was upset that I was there, but he had thought I was just going to City Hall, and people had just arrived that they were trying to not let the young people see with bricks and arrive to cause trouble. And I know which organization they are with. But throughout these, my police chiefs have walked with the young people. They have been alert. They have worked together. And I've had 2 bad incidences out of the 17. One where a woman ran a car through us. And the second where young people heard a word that they should never hear once. And I was called a white, several not pleasant words. So, but our police chief handled them. And I think that that's what we want to talk about today, because I think Americans have the right to peacefully assemble and protest. It's a fundamental right of our democracy. And how these get handled is really important. So we've got to ask these questions, because we don't have a witness today, has been said, but we've got to make sure that that freedom of speech and that freedom to, I'm proud of some of the young people, and yet that I've seen out there, but we don't want to see windows in some of these areas have deliberately been broken. And my law enforcement knew that I was being targeted by some people, and I wasn't going to let that stop me either. But I want to ask some questions of both Mr. McDonald and Ms. Brace. Mr. McDonald, some of my colleagues across the aisle have attempted to use the actions of a few protesters at a separate protest against police brutality to depict the peaceful protest that you were part of as violent, or call it a riot. I want to be clear. Mr. McDonald, did you personally witness violence or rioting prior to the police attacking the protesters on June 1st?
No, ma'am.
Ms. Brace, would you agree with Mr. McDonald? Did you witness violent activity or any sort of similar events prior to the police moving against the protesters on June 1st?
No, I did not.
Furthermore, during these attacks, you identified yourself repeatedly as a member of the media, correct? When you did that, when you announced yourself, did they refrain from violence? And they went after your cameraman, so even if they didn't see your media credential, which people have raised a question, it was pretty obvious that your cameraman was a member of the media, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
And can you talk about the injuries you and your cameraman sustained and the damage your equipment took?
Tim suffered what I would describe as a harder hit than what I did, as you saw in that video, with the shield to his stomach. And then the camera was punched, which pushed it back into his face. He also was hit with a non-lethal projectile in the back of the neck. I, as you saw, was struck across the back with a truncheon, and I was hit a few times in the legs by non-lethal bullets. I was hit quite directly in the backside, though. That would be my most significant injury. In terms of our gear, the camera, obviously, that Tim was holding up to his face was damaged when it was punched. A separate lens that I was carrying in my backpack was damaged when I was hit. And also our live transmission device, we call it a TVU, was significantly damaged when it was hit by
several $1,000s worth of. I want to ask you one more quick. Mr. McDonald, you mentioned in your testimony that you took pictures and videos during the attack. Why did you feel like it was important to document everything that was happening?
I believe it was a pivotal point in history just to be out there amongst those diverse protesters. And secondly was for my safety, because Trump had made the threat of using weapons and dogs on us. And I really took it literally. So that was the second main reason why I recorded.
Thank you. My time is up, but thank you, all of you, for being here, and the bishop, too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me express my gratitude to all of our witnesses this morning, to the ranking member as well. During this difficult moment in our history, we're grieving more than a senseless murder of George Floyd. This is not new. The outrage is not new. We are grieving the 400-year legacy of the intergenerational trauma from slavery, lynchings, the Jim Crow era, and police brutality. The racial injustice rooted in our country's history is still costing us innocent lives. What we are seeing today is the result of historic injustices that have kept people living in poverty in communities where schools have fewer resources and where people live less long due to lack of health care coupled with aggressive policing. Earlier this month, organizers and protest participants were attacked while demonstrating against police brutality in D.C., and this hearing brings that out. Facing protests over the use of force, the U.S. Park Police responded with more force. Mr. McDonald, thank you for being here. In your testimony, you shared that you received training in CS gas, also known as tear gas, during your time in boot camp. Can you describe the conditions under which you were instructed to use tear gas during your training and how that compares to what you witnessed at Lafayette Square?
Well, first of all, in boot camp, it was controlled. It was around medics, and they had personnel there because it was done in a safe environment. What I witnessed at Lafayette Square was excessive force. They did it without any kind of medical people around. They knew people would get injured behind this, and the Navy did it a much better, safer way. It was done because we were in boot camp, a controlled environment. Although we were protesting, they threw that. I just think that we weren't prepared for that. They shouldn't have used that on protesters. They're not soldiers.
So based on your training, the U.S. Park Police, they didn't follow the proper protocols, in your opinion?
Yeah, that can't be a necessary way to remove people.
Thank you. Black and brown communities are already being ravaged by the deadly virus and an unprecedented economic crisis. Now, they're being terrorized by militarized police. The militarization of law enforcement and the unjustified use of force against organizers and community members must end. Tear gas is a chemical weapon banned in war, and it should never again be used against demonstrators, but especially not during a pandemic. We've heard countless stories of organizers and protest participants suffering traumatic injuries at the hands of law enforcement, or like Mr. McDonald, who was, quote, met with tear gas and a flash bangs which exploded with shrapnel. That is why my colleagues Takano and Ocasio and I introduced a bill to stop the escalation of such police tactics against peaceful demonstrators and ban the use of chemical weapons in our streets. The bottom line is the rightful demonstrations that we are witnessing in the wake of the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other Black lives taken by the police should never have been met with the deadly force from law enforcement. The U.S. Park Police and other police and military forces forcibly removed peaceful protesters with chemical irritants, and for what? For the president's photo op? I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Let me recognize Mr. Soto for his questions and his time. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The whole nation witnessed videos showing President Trump, White House justice and defense officials authorize use of force to remove peaceful protesters. Lafayette Square Park and the adjacent Pennsylvania Avenue, an area right in front of the White House, is our nation's public square. This is a traditional area for Americans to express our First Amendment rights, the infringement of which deserves heightened scrutiny. It was particularly disgraceful that these tactics were used so the president could engage in a photo op. Many have testified that the incident occurred 1 hour before curfew. I do agree with other members of this committee that city officials should be wary about creating curfews of otherwise peaceful protests. These dictated curfews often create unnecessary conflict between police and peaceful protesters. We know, based upon the testimony, this was not the case in this incident. I want to welcome Professor Turley to the committee. I'd be remiss if I didn't say this harkens me back to 14 years ago in your Supreme Court's class at GW Law, and want to thank you for being such a great teacher. Professor Turley, some evidence suggests that the crowd was cleared for purposes of a photo op. Other evidence suggests the president wanted to display a show of strength after damaging coverage of him retreating to a bunker a few days earlier. I'm concerned that the president may have specifically intended to intimidate or silence political speech, or simply that he didn't care about the injuries that would occur as a result of his actions. In those last minutes that you really focus on before they begin clearing the area, if President Trump or other responsible officials harbored either specific intent to intimidate or silence political speech, or at the very least had a reckless disregard for the safety and First Amendment rights of protesters, would either of those states of mind be relevant in determining violation of their First Amendment rights?
Thank you very much for that question. This is, in fact, my ideal to have a former student asking me a question, looking at two counsels on either side of the chair that are both GW grads and a photographer who is a GW student. So I could not be in a happier spot. But to answer your question, most certainly the intent does matter. That's where my testimony first starts out with the motivational question. That motivational question, I think we will get more salient information with the inquiry of Congress. And one of the things that personally I would look at is it seems to me that there is evidence that the plan was put into place 48 hours before in terms of development. It was approved in the morning, an order went out at 2. That does not mean, however, that it answers, even if those facts are true, whether the president's photo op played a role in the size of the perimeter, the decision to move people all the way to I Street, for example. Those are things that are legitimate questions. And as I said, you know, if Attorney General Barr cleared that area for the purpose of a photo op, despite knowing him for many years, being a graduate of our law school, I would immediately call for him to step down, because that would be an outrageous use of power. So the answer is yes. If this was done to intimidate people, this would be a serious problem. The Supreme Court said in Bose that protests are classically political speech, and that's why the courts have been so protective. And so I think that your question is a relevant one, and more importantly, we can get those answers as we get more of these facts confirmed from Congress.
Thank you, Professor Turley. Mr. McDonald, thank you for your service to our country. On behalf of the United States government, I would like to apologize for your brutal treatment you received by your own government. We recently passed the Justice in Policing Act of 2020. It stops the militarization of police by stopping a federal program that gives local police surplus military equipment. As a veteran familiar with the differences between the objectives of military and police, how important is it to stop the demilitarization of our police force?
It's very important. I mean, you lose control once I think you militarize too much. The military is there for a certain reason, and city cops are there for a certain reason. We have distinguished who does what, and I just think given the city police and like park police, reasons to act like a military unit isn't good for any kind of protest going forward.
Thank you. Ms. Brace, on behalf of the United States government, I'd like to apologize for your brutal treatment by this government. I'm appalled about how you and Mr. McDonald were treated. We've seen an increasing level of violence against members of the press in the United States as of late. What do you suggest needs to happen to better protect members of the press in the United States?
Again, I wouldn't presume to tell the American people how to run their government or their police force. I think basically the First Amendment needs to be enforced in that the media needs to be able to work freely and without fear, especially from law enforcement.
And finally, Bishop Budde, you were installed on November 12, 2011, so you've had a lot of experience with Lafayette Square. How often do you see people protest in Lafayette Square?
I don't know that I could count, but it is, as I said before, it's the park where people gather, and it's a common site for protests. I think there are protests there every day, actually, one time or another.
Thank you.
Thanks, and I yield back.
Let me recognize Mr. Hertzford. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I know all too well the pain and loss that the Black community has faced because of law enforcement's abuse of force. What took place at Lafayette Park stands against our nation's ideals. Peaceful protesters were exercising their First Amendment constitutional rights. Unfortunately, the president, in an effort to have an ill-advised and unnecessary photo op, decided to upend the First Amendment rights of peaceful protesters at Lafayette Park by using tear gas and firing rubber pellets on them. It is important that lawmakers can look outside their windows and see and hear protesters. They are letting their government know that change must occur. Instead, this president acted like an authoritarian dictator and used excessive force so he could stage a 3-minute photo op at the historic St. John's Episcopal Church. This is simply wrong. As a black man, as a father of 3 children, 2 young boys, I know we must find more common ground and enact real reforms across this nation and for my home state in Nevada. We need to continue to have honest dialogue about race and other injustices, and more importantly, act boldly for the change that we need throughout our society. Unfortunately, those actions taken by the president at Lafayette Square do not bring us closer to solving these problems. In fact, they make it worse. Mr. McDonald, can you tell us what brought you to the protest and what was your general feelings about your fellow protesters? Were they peaceful? Did you see anybody doing anything different than exercising their First Amendment rights?
Well, my reason was there for my First Amendment rights, protesting for inequity in Justice Department. Everyone I've seen from the minute I started recording from 6 o'clock until the minute they attacked us was peaceful. I didn't see anything being thrown other than chanting and, verbal things they were saying. No one attacked those officers.
Thank you. And what was your first reaction when police in riot gear used tear gas on you and your fellow peaceful protesters?
It's confusion first, because you know it's 30 minutes before curfew. And then you wonder, why are they doing this? Like, what happened? You would have thought something drastically happened for that to change from a peaceful protest to literally 3 seconds. They switched and turned to a military unit. It was confusion.
Ms. Brace, seeing the way you were treated in that video is shocking, to say the least. You were clearly identified as a member of the press. You were in an area designated for members of the press, and yet those officers were completely indiscriminate in their attack. In your years of experience as a reporter, have you or your cameraman ever been treated this way before?
No.
When you set up to work that day, did you assume you'd be safe from violence at the hands of law enforcement?
Yes, absolutely.
Why?
Because of the First Amendment and the respect for the media in a democracy.
So can you tell us more about the conduct of law enforcement that you've observed as a reporter, and what was it that happened at Lafayette Square the first time that you've experienced this?
Well, as you saw in the video, we were there to report on what was happening, expecting the curfew to come into effect at 7 p.m. Then that line of police came through very early, very suddenly, and very quickly. We moved right to the side where we were very much out of their way. There is nothing that would have prevented them walking past us easily, and that's when they turned on us and we were both physically assaulted. In terms of the protest itself, I would say that it was largely peaceful. It was very different to the night before, where we did see those fires and looting. There was nothing of the sort on the afternoon of June the 1st.
Thank you. Right Reverend BUDDE, can you please talk about the teachings of the Episcopalian faith and whether those are in line with the current president's actions of using tear gas by police in riot gear against peaceful protesters? What was your reaction when the current president used a Bible for the sole purpose of a photo op?
As I've stated before, there is nothing in Scripture or in the teachings of our church that would condone violent actions of state officials against innocent protesters. And so I would say that it's completely antithetical to the teachings of our church. When I saw the president hold a Bible in front of the church, as I said, I felt he had usurped he was taking a spiritual message or claiming a spiritual authority that he did not have to justify or to bolster a message that was counter to our teachings and our attempt to follow Jesus and his way of love.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Tonko, you're recognized, sir.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses also, thank you. I'm devastated that this hearing is needed, but it is absolutely needed. I see massive pain in this country, our country right now. For many, this pain comes from the nervous uncertainty of living in a world dominated by a deadly, highly contagious virus. The last 4 months have shown many of us what it is like to live in a society where you don't get to write the rules. So Black Americans have known that feeling for 400 years. They are the descendants of a people kidnapped into slavery They are the product of pervasive and systematic racist policies, not just Southern Jim Crow laws, but racist federal policy as well. Black Americans were forbidden from claiming land in the Homestead Act, excluding them from the largest and most permanent wealth giveaway in our American history. They were effectively excluded from the New Deal and the GI Bill, which can be argued as the foundation for our American middle class. They were, and in many cases still are, legally allowed to be profiled against by a police officer who could use that power to investigate, intimidate, and far too often end a life. And now, thanks to the compendium of institutional racism, they're getting sick and dying from COVID at a much higher rate than white Americans. But Black Americans are sadly used to living in a society where for the longest time, they didn't get to write the rules. I'm a 71-year-old white man, and I will never know what that feels like. But I am brokenhearted that as a member of our society, I share some responsibility for the pain Black Americans feel. So let me begin my questions to address them first to Her Excellency Bishop BUDDE. And Bishop, did I pronounce your last name correctly?
You did.
Okay. What does Christianity teach us to do if we have harmed others?
To seek restitution, forgiveness, and at all times mercy, because we all fall short in the sight of God.
Thank you. And the protest in Lafayette Square on June 1st and repeatedly since then across the country is asking, begging for an end to this pain. And as a fellow believer, it seems this is the moment, if any, where we should be asking for such forgiveness and then doing what we can to eliminate pain into the future. Mr. McDonald, can you remind me again how the peaceful protesters were treated?
We were treated with weapons of war. We were treated like criminals. We were treated like we were breaking the law. We were only exercising our First Amendment rights.
Well, I think that, as we've learned today, nothing in this response sounds compassionate to me. Nothing in this response sounds like a teaching we would find in any book of faith that would guide any one of us. Nothing in that response sounds forgiving to me. And as one who has practiced my faith, I think that it is part of some of the fundamentals that we all share in making certain that we are a just and loving society. So I deeply implore our nation's president and any of her leaders to refer to some of the scripture and certainly scripture found in that book that he held outside of St. John's Church that day. And I would encourage him to revisit the verse from Micah 6:8, which reads, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God?" I think that's instruction for all of us. Mr. Chair, we have got to do better. Let us heed the words of Micah. As a nation, let us resolve to go forward, to build a fairer nation. Let us now do the hard work of laboring for justice, denouncing violence, loving kindness, and most certainly walking humbly, but hurriedly on the path to what we all respect, a more perfect union. With that, I yield back. And again, thank our witnesses for being here today, for adding what they did to today's discussion and providing for that sort of clarity that we're all looking for. And Mr. Chair, again, I do yield back and thank you for the opportunity.
And thank you, sir, for, I may say, very profound and important comments that you made. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank the witnesses. I appreciate it very much. All four being here today, my colleagues through the series of 2.5 hours that you've been here have asked a lot of the questions that were important to me. I think that we heard a lot of important information today about the attack on the protesters at Lafayette Square on June 1st. But we didn't hear a peep from the administration. We invited Acting Park Police Chief Monahan We jumped through hoops as different requirements were presented to us in terms of his coming forward. And then the latest one was that he was too busy, and there could be a conflict because of potential litigation down the road. And it would have been very helpful to have him here, or representative of the department, so we could understand which version of the truth they've offered, and they've offered several since June 1st, is actually the correct one. And so that there is no mistake that nothing is being hidden from the American people, that it's out there and it's transparent, and it is our responsibility to provide that oversight. And one thing also as well today is that we look at what my colleagues said today, and the analysis from my respected Republican colleagues, the main witness, depends, the analysis as I got it depends on the administration telling the truth. That would, I think, create some skepticism and doubt among many, many, many Americans at this point. We also heard from our colleagues about a lot of things that didn't happen that day. The assumption is that the protesters at Lafayette Square were dangerous by association. And that is not the way it should have been approached. Prejudging a group of people based on unrelated actions separate from them, of others, might be at the very heart of the problem here. Maybe the protesters, and to deal with this in a bipartisan way, I remember the calls for de-escalation, restraint, extended patience when we were dealing with the takeover of Park facility by armed individuals, and when the struggle over the BUDDE family and their refusal to pay fees for grazing on public lands, and action by the federal government to try to redeem that. And I hope that same bipartisan attitude of restraint and not create a double standard in which, because perhaps the message in this one is not what you wanted to hear in Lafayette Square, just like the message that the Bundys were having when they refused to arm themselves, I didn't want to hear, but that's what the Park Police chose, that's what the U.S. Marshal chose, that's what the FBI chose. Restraint, patience, prolonged patience, I might add. I also want to talk a little bit about that leading up to this hearing, a lot of the discussion about issues having to do with what led up to this. And that's why I made my point about people shouldn't be associated with anything that's going on, that the protesters are the enemy, that they're not American citizens exercising their right under the First Amendment, that it's about the statutes, that it's about the isolated series of violence. Let me guarantee you, I've been around long enough and been to enough protests and been arrested for civil disobedience myself to know and to be able to say that the tail is not wagging the dog on this movement that's going on in America right now. The dog is in charge, and that's the American people. And those outlier issues of opportunism, whether appropriating the Black Lives movement for either a narrow ideological point or a criminal point, should not be reflected onto what people are trying to say out in America, period. And I also have felt that this has opened up many things. And the ironies of ironies, you have Mr. Penley, Trump is recommending to run the other BLM, the Bureau of Land Management. And he is one that did an op-ed piece that said that the Black Lives Matter movement is built on terrible lies, and goes again to make those associations and he will be in charge of the biggest landmass agency that we have in this country if the Senate approves. I think these contradictions, the fact that we're asked to believe and that the administration won't come forward and allow a full questioning and a full disclosure and transparency of all the information related to what happened June 1st, I think leads us to continue to press for the issue, not only of accountability, but of reform with our Park Service police that has to change. And hopefully this hearing and you as witnesses, thank you so much. Members might ask you questions. You have a period of time to return those as well, your responses, but I appreciate your time.
Mr. Chairman.
And I appreciate all the patience
Chairman,
that you've shown today. And meetings just...
I actually ask unanimous consent to add one more letter into the record, which was sent by the Secretary to you, inviting you also to visit the
sometimes with the officers. Yes.
And I look forward to working with you in a bipartisan manner because the administration did have an option, a willingness to come here and talk about their point of view. We need to make sure that that is there and that is accommodated in the future. Thank you. And just one last thing. Be careful about when you're talking about the experience in the West, which was supposedly done in a nonviolent way because it did leave one of the citizens of my state dead in the snow.
On that uplifting note, let me adjourn the meeting and thank you very much, all of you. I appreciate it. We all do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you.
Yeah. And thank you all. As someone who represents the press, I know it's but it is a unique society. Park police will often I thought I saw a credential.
I had credentials just not around my neck.
Oh, I thought I saw one on film.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
No, I don't wear them around my neck because someone can pull that.
Because we went through that with the park police.
To wear it around my neck.
No, that's why.
Yeah.
Because we went through that with the park police in the case.
We appreciate Yeah, no, we definitely had our credentials. Just
Well, that was a terrific testimony. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to
Sorry
meet you.
for what happened here.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Who's your boss?